Helen Bergstrom was 34 years old when she began constructing a small, semicircular metal-roofed cabin inside her family's large timber barn in October of 1877, and every neighbor who saw what she was building thought she had completely lost her mind. "She's building a house inside a house," they would say with confused laughter. "The barn is already shelter. Why would anyone waste time and materials building another structure inside it?" The woman must be confused from exhaustion or grief. By January of 1878, during the worst blizzard in Minnesota Territory history, those same neighbors were desperately seeking refuge in Helen's barn, discovering that the small inner cabin she had built was the only structure in the entire region maintaining survivable warmth, while conventional homes throughout the territory were failing catastrophically, killing families who froze to death inside their own cabins, despite burning every piece of furniture they owned. Helen had arrived in the Minnesota Territory in the spring of 1874 with her husband Lars and their 3 children, daughters Anna and Elsa, ages 8 and 6, and son Eric, age 4. Together they had established a productive homestead on a quarter-section claim near the settlement of New Ulm, and Lars had built a solid timber barn in 1875 to house their livestock and store hay for the winter. Lars died in September of 1877 from a sudden illness that took him in less than 3 days. His death left Helen widowed at 34, with 3 young children, a functional homestead, and a desperate sense that the approaching winter was going to be far more dangerous than anything they had experienced before. Helen had grown up in northern Sweden, where her father had been a builder who specialized in structures designed to withstand Arctic conditions. He had taught her from childhood about thermodynamics, insulation principles, and the critical importance of creating multiple barriers against extreme cold. A single wall, no matter how thick, can fail during extreme cold, he had explained to her countless times. True protection comes from layers, wall within wall, room within room, barrier within barrier. When Arctic storms come, you need depth of defense, not just thickness. During the 3 years she and Lars had lived in Minnesota, Helen had noticed that the winters here, while cold, were not truly severe by Swedish Arctic standards. They experienced temperatures down to perhaps -10 or -15 during the coldest January nights, and their well-built log cabin handled these conditions adequately with a good stove and proper wood supply. But in the weeks following Lars's death, Helen began experiencing vivid dreams about an approaching winter unlike anything Minnesota had seen before. She would wake in the night with clear images of sustained extreme cold, not brief cold snaps, but weeks of -30 to -40 temperatures, cold so severe that conventional cabins couldn't maintain interior warmth, even with fires burning continuously. She saw families huddled around stoves in 20-degree interiors, slowly succumbing to hypothermia inside their own homes. Helen was not a superstitious woman, but these dreams were so vivid and consistent that she couldn't dismiss them as ordinary anxiety. They felt more like warnings, like premonitions of genuine danger that she needed to prepare for whether or not anyone else believed her. She began thinking seriously about how to protect her 3 children if such an extreme winter actually materialized. Their cabin was solid construction, 8-inch pine logs with good chinking, a tight roof, a reliable stove. It was adequate for normal Minnesota winters, but if the cold reached the sustained extremes her dreams were showing her, the cabin would fail, just like every other conventional structure. Heat would escape through the log walls faster than the stove could generate it, and the interior temperature would drop to dangerous levels. What she needed, Helen realized, was not just one barrier against the cold, but multiple barriers. A structure within a structure, creating layers of insulation and dead air space that would trap heat and prevent its escape. and the logical place to build such a protective inner structure was inside their large timber barn. The barn that Lars had built measured 30 feet wide by 40 feet long, with walls made of heavy vertical timber planks and a peaked roof. It was designed primarily for livestock and hay storage, with a large open interior space. The barn itself provided some shelter and wind protection, but it was not heated, and its interior temperature would drop to near outside conditions during winter. But what if she built a small, heavily insulated cabin inside that barn? The barn's massive timber walls would provide the first barrier against wind and weather. The small inner cabin would provide a second barrier, creating a double wall system with dead airspace between. And if she made the inner cabin small enough, just large enough for her family to sleep in, she could heat the compact space efficiently with minimal fuel, while the surrounding barn provided additional thermal protection. Helen designed the inner cabin to be semicircular in profile, like a curved Quonset structure, because she remembered her father explaining that curved roofs shed snow better and distribute structural loads more evenly than flat roofs. She would use salvaged metal sheeting for the curved roof, heavy timber for the walls, and multiple layers of insulation to create a thermal envelope far superior to any conventional cabin. In early October of 1877, Helen began construction of the inner cabin inside the barn, working alone with occasional help from her oldest daughter Anna, who at 8 years old was already learning the building skills her Swedish grandfather would have taught. She started by clearing a space in the barn's southeast corner, moving hay bales and equipment to create a working area approximately 12 feet wide by 14 feet long. This would be the footprint of her inner cabin, deliberately small to minimize the volume that would need heating, but adequate for 4 people to sleep in during the coldest nights. She built the floor first using heavy pine planks that Lars had milled but never used before his death. Each plank was 3 inches thick and 8 inches wide, substantial timber that would create a solid platform. She elevated this floor 6 inches above the barn's dirt floor on log supports positioned every 2 feet, creating a stable framework that wouldn't settle or shift. This elevation served multiple critical purposes. It prevented ground cold from conducting directly upward into the living space. It created an air gap that would serve as additional insulation, and it kept the floor dry by preventing any ground moisture from reaching the wood. Between the log supports beneath the floor, Helen packed the space completely with hay. She used tightly compressed bales, breaking them apart and tamping the loose hay firmly into every gap. This created an insulating layer approximately 4 inches thick, running under the entire floor area. The R value of this hay layer, though she wouldn't have used that modern term, was approximately R20, meaning heat loss through the floor would be minimal. The floor installation took her 3 full days, working from dawn to dusk. Each plank had to be precisely cut to fit. Each joint had to be tight enough to prevent drafts. Each nail had to be driven true to prevent squeaks or movement. By October 8th, she had completed a floor that was solid, level, and well insulated from below. The wall construction began October 9th and would consume most of the next 2 weeks. Helen built the walls using a double-layer system that created unprecedented insulation thickness for frontier construction. The inner wall was made of vertical planks, 8-inch wide boards positioned vertically from floor to ceiling, edge to edge, creating a solid wooden interior surface. She chinked the joints between boards with oakum and clay, ensuring no air gaps or drafts. The outer wall, positioned exactly 18 inches away from the inner wall, was also vertical planks of the same dimensions. She built wooden frames first, vertical posts every 4 feet connected by horizontal cross members, creating the skeletal structure to which both inner and outer wall planks would be attached. The critical element was the 18-inch space between these 2 walls. Helen filled this gap with hay, working methodically from bottom to top. She would attach the inner wall planks first, then pack hay into the cavity, compressing it firmly to eliminate air pockets, then attach the outer wall planks. The hay filling had to be dense enough to prevent settling, but not so compressed that it lost its insulating air spaces. This 18-inch hay-filled cavity created an insulation barrier with an estimated R value of approximately R60, more than 3 times better than the 8-inch log walls of conventional cabins, which had R values around R8 to R10. Heat loss through these walls would be minimal compared to standard construction. The south wall, which would face into the barn's interior, included the doorway. Helen framed this opening with double-thickness timbers and constructed a door made from 2 layers of 3-inch planks with hay insulation sandwiched between them. The door alone was 6 inches thick total, creating a thermal barrier that would prevent heat loss even when the inner cabin was fully heated. Wall construction consumed 2 weeks of intensive work. Each wall section had to be built carefully to maintain the precise 18-inch spacing between inner and outer layers. The hay packing had to be methodical and thorough to ensure consistent insulation throughout. By October 22nd, all 4 walls were complete, creating a box-like structure with extraordinarily thick insulated walls. For the curved metal roof that would give the cabin its distinctive semicircular profile, Helen had to solve several technical challenges. She wanted a barrel vault shape because her father had taught her that curved roofs distribute snow loads more evenly than peaked roofs and shed snow more efficiently, preventing dangerous accumulation. But creating a proper curve with salvaged flat metal sheets required careful planning and execution. She had made 3 wagon trips in late September to an abandoned mining operation about 10 miles southwest, hauling back corrugated iron panels that had once covered equipment sheds. These panels were weathered and rusty but still structurally sound. Each sheet was approximately 4 feet wide by 8 feet long, made of galvanized iron with corrugation ridges running lengthwise. To create the curved roof, Helen first built wooden ribs, curved supports that would define the arch shape and support the metal panels. She carved these ribs from straight logs using a technique her father had taught her. She would carefully split a log lengthwise, then use heat and moisture to slowly bend each half into the desired curve, securing them in that curved position until they set permanently. Each rib took nearly a full day to create, and she needed 6 ribs total to span the 12-foot width at 2-foot intervals. These curved wooden ribs she attached to the tops of the walls, creating a framework that arched from one side of the cabin to the other. The curve was a gentle arc with a radius of approximately 8 feet, creating a ceiling height of 7 feet at the center, tapering to 5 feet at the walls. Over this curved wooden framework, Helen laid the metal panels, overlapping them like shingles to shed water. The corrugations in the metal ran perpendicular to the curve, allowing the panels to flex slightly and conform to the arch shape. She secured each panel to the wooden ribs using nails with lead washers to prevent leaks at the penetration points. Above the metal layer, she spread thick layers of loose hay, approximately 8 inches deep, covering the entire curved surface. This hay provided substantial insulation, creating an R value of approximately R30 for the roof assembly. Over the hay, she stretched canvas tarps salvaged from old wagon covers, securing them tightly to hold the hay in place and provide additional weather protection. The final layer of protection was the barn's own peaked roof, which sat approximately 4 feet above the inner cabin's curved roof. This created a substantial air gap, with the barn's roof providing the ultimate weather barrier, while the inner cabin's curved roof handled the thermal protection. The entrance to the inner cabin was a heavy door made from double-thickness planks with hay insulation sandwiched between the layers. She positioned this door facing into the barn's interior rather than toward the exterior walls, creating an additional buffer zone. To enter the inner cabin, You would first come into the barn through the barn's main door, walk across the barn's interior, and then enter the inner cabin. Two sets of doors creating an airlock effect that prevented cold air from reaching the heated interior space. Inside the cabin, Helen installed a small cast-iron stove. Not the large stove from their main cabin, but a smaller model that would be adequate for heating the compact space. The stovepipe extended upward through the curved metal roof, through the barn's roof, and out into the open air. She carefully sealed around the pipe penetrations with metal collars and clay to prevent heat loss and fire risk. By late October, the inner cabin was complete. From inside the barn, it looked like a small, curved metal hut sitting in the corner, an odd structure that seemed to serve no clear purpose to anyone who didn't understand Helen's reasoning. When Helen's neighbors learned about what she had built, the reactions were universally confused and critical. Sarah Fletcher, who lived on the neighboring homestead, visited in early November while Helen was finishing the interior details. "Helen, I don't understand what you've built here," Sarah said, examining the curved metal cabin from the outside. "You've constructed a little house inside your barn, but the barn is already shelter. Why would you need another structure inside it? This seems like a waste of time and materials that you could have used for other purposes." "It's for protection during extreme cold," Helen explained. "If this winter brings the kind of sustained cold I've been dreaming about, our regular cabin won't maintain adequate warmth. This inner cabin, protected by the barn walls and heavily insulated, will stay warm even during extreme conditions." Sarah looked at her with obvious concern. "Helen, I know Lars's death has been hard on you, and I know you've been having bad dreams, but building a house inside a house based on bad dreams, that's not rational planning. That's anxiety and grief making you do strange things. Minnesota winters are cold, yes, but we've all survived them in regular cabins. This elaborate double structure you've built is unnecessary." "I hope you're right," Helen said quietly. "I truly hope this winter is normal, and I've wasted my effort. But if my dreams are correct, this structure will keep my children alive." George Peterson, another neighbor, was even more dismissive when he visited in mid-November. "People are talking about your barn cabin," he said bluntly. "Some folks think you're not managing well on your own, building strange structures that serve no purpose, working yourself to exhaustion on unnecessary projects. There's concern that maybe you should consider moving back east, where you'd have family support, instead of trying to manage this homestead alone." Helen felt anger rising, but kept her voice level. "Mr. Peterson, I'm managing this homestead just fine. My children are healthy and we have adequate supplies. This cabin is a precautionary measure based on sound thermal engineering principles, not a sign of mental instability. I would appreciate it if you would respect my decisions regarding my own property." But Peterson's attitude reflected the broader community sentiment. Over the following weeks, Helen became aware that her barn cabin had become a popular topic of conversation and mockery throughout the region. People questioned her judgment, her mental state, her ability to manage independently. A few genuinely concerned neighbors offered help or advice, but most simply dismissed her as a confused widow, doing strange things from grief and stress. Helen pressed forward with her preparations, regardless of the criticism. In late November, she moved bedding, supplies, and emergency provisions into the inner cabin. She stocked it with enough firewood for weeks of heating, with extra food supplies, with blankets and warm clothing. She created a routine where she and the children would spend their days in the main cabin doing normal activities. But at night, they would move to the inner cabin in the barn to sleep in the heavily protected space. The children, Anna, now 8, Elsa, 6, Eric, 4, adapted to this unusual arrangement without complaint. They understood that their mother was trying to protect them, even if they didn't fully understand from what. December brought moderately cold weather, temperatures around 0 to -10, typical for Minnesota territory. Throughout the settlement, families maintained comfortable homes with normal heating. People who had mocked Helen's barn cabin felt vindicated in their criticism. "See," they would say to each other, "normal winter just like every year. That poor woman built an elaborate structure for nothing based on anxiety dreams. Proof that she's not thinking clearly." Then, on January 8th of 1878, the atmospheric conditions shifted catastrophically. A massive Arctic air mass, the largest and coldest outbreak in recorded Minnesota history, moved south from the Canadian Arctic, bringing temperatures that plunged to levels never before experienced in the territory. The temperature dropped from -5 to -28 overnight, then continued dropping. January 9th morning, -34. January 10th morning, -39. January 11th morning, -43, and holding at that level for days. At -43, sustained for days extending into weeks, conventional cabin heating systems throughout Minnesota Territory experienced catastrophic and progressive failure as families watched helplessly while their homes became death traps despite burning every piece of combustible material they could find. Week 1, January 8th through 14th, averaged -41 degrees, creating the initial crisis as families discovered that their conventional log cabins simply could not maintain survivable interior warmth no matter how much wood they burned. George Peterson's cabin illustrated the typical failure pattern that was repeating throughout the territory. His cabin was solid 8-inch pine log construction, horizontally stacked logs, chinked with moss and clay, peaked roof covered with wooden shakes, large cast-iron stove positioned centrally for heating. In normal -15 Minnesota winters, this construction maintained comfortable 55 to 60 degree interiors with steady burning of approximately half a cord of wood per week. But at -41 average exterior temperature during week 1, the fundamental physics of heat transfer exceeded the design limits of frontier construction. Heat flows from warm areas to cold areas at a rate determined by the temperature difference divided by the thermal resistance of the barrier between them. Peterson's 8-inch log walls had a thermal resistance of approximately R8, with an interior temperature of 50 degrees and an exterior temperature of -41. The temperature difference was 91 degrees. This 91-degree difference divided by R8 resistance created a heat loss rate of approximately 11 BTUs per square foot per hour through the walls. Peterson's cabin had approximately 600 square feet of wall and roof surface area, meaning total heat loss was approximately 6,600 BTUs per hour. His large stove, burning at maximum capacity, could generate perhaps 8,000 BTUs per hour when fed continuously with dry hardwood. This left only 1,400 BTUs per hour available to actually warm the interior space and compensate for air infiltration through gaps and the door. On January 9th, Peterson increased his wood burning to maximum sustainable rate, feeding the stove every hour, keeping the firebox completely full, running the stove so hot it glowed dull red. He was consuming approximately 1.5 cords per week, triple his normal rate. But despite this maximum effort, the cabin interior temperature was steadily declining. January 10th, interior temperature, 42 degrees. January 11th, 38 degrees. January 12th, 32 degrees, despite burning continuously at absolute maximum capacity. His family, wife Martha and children Sarah, age 7, and Thomas, age 5, were huddling within 6 feet of the glowing stove, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, wrapped in all available blankets and quilts. The children were showing early hypothermia symptoms by January 12th. Sarah was confused and lethargic. Thomas was shivering uncontrollably. Both were complaining of numbness in their fingers and toes. The Fletcher family's cabin experienced similar progressive failure. Samuel Fletcher burned through his 6-cord winter supply in just 8 days, trying to maintain warmth. Then began burning furniture, tables, chairs, spare boards, anything wooden and combustible. By January 14th, his cabin interior had dropped to 28 degrees, despite having burned nearly everything he owned except the beds and the walls themselves. Throughout the settlement, the pattern repeated with minor variations. Every conventional 8-inch wall cabin was losing the battle against sustained -41 cold. Interior temperatures were dropping into the 20s and 30s despite maximum burning. Families were facing the impossible choice between continuing to burn fuel at unsustainable rates while watching their homes slowly freeze anyway, or abandoning their cabins entirely and seeking alternative shelter somewhere. Week 2, January 15th through 21st, continued at -42 average with no sign of moderation, creating compounding desperation as families exhausted both their fuel supplies and their physical reserves. By January 16th, the Peterson family was in critical condition. The cabin interior had stabilized at approximately 24 degrees. George could maintain this temperature by burning continuously, but he couldn't raise it any higher. 24 degrees was slowly killing his family. Young Thomas had stopped shivering, a dangerous sign indicating his body was losing the ability to generate heat. Martha was suffering from severe headaches and disorientation from prolonged cold exposure. George made the desperate decision to walk to Helen's homestead seeking help. The distance was nearly 2 miles through -42 conditions. He bundled himself in every warm garment he owned and set out at midday on January 16th. The walk through that cold was a near-death experience. He had to stop every few hundred yards to prevent his extremities from freezing completely. His face and hands, despite being covered, developed frostbite within the first quarter mile. His lungs burned from breathing the Arctic air. By the time he reached Helen's barn, he was barely conscious and showing advanced hypothermia symptoms. Helen's barn interior, at approximately -12 degrees, felt warm compared to the -42 exterior. The barn's massive timber walls were providing substantial protection, warming the trapped air by 30 degrees just through their insulating effect and wind-blocking capacity. But the real warmth was in the inner cabin. Helen brought George through the barn and into the small, curved structure where 60-degree warmth hit him like a physical force. He collapsed just inside the door, crying from the combination of relief and despair. Relief that such warmth existed, despair that his family was dying in a 24-degree cabin just 2 miles away. Helen got him warm, got him some hot soup, treated his frostbite as best she could. Then she listened to his story about the failing cabin and the dying children. "We need to bring your family here immediately," Helen said. "Can you guide me back to your place? We'll take the wagon and move them tonight." The rescue operation January 16th evening was dangerous but successful. Helen hitched her horse to the wagon, loaded it with blankets and furs, and drove through the deadly cold to the Peterson homestead with George giving directions. They found Martha and the children in desperate condition. Thomas was barely responsive. Sarah was confused and crying. Martha was unable to stand without assistance. Helen wrapped them in every available blanket and fur, loaded them into the wagon bed, and drove back to her barn through the killing cold. She brought them directly into the inner cabin, where the 60-degree warmth began reviving them immediately. Young Thomas, who had been near death, began crying, a good sign indicating his body was warming and recovering sensation. Week 3, January 22nd through 28th, averaged -43, the coldest week of the entire outbreak, creating catastrophic conditions throughout the region as even the most well-built cabins reached their absolute failure point. But the inner cabin in the barn was performing exactly as Helen had designed it to perform. The barn's massive timber walls provided the first barrier, taking the brunt of the exterior -43 cold. The barn's interior temperature, while still cold, was warmer than outside, approximately -20. The inner cabin, surrounded by that -20 barn air instead of -43 exterior air, had a much smaller temperature difference to overcome, and with its double wall construction and 18 inches of hay insulation in the walls, plus the multiple layer roof system, heat loss was minimal. Helen heated the inner cabin with the small stove, burning modest amounts of wood. The compact space, just 12 by 14 feet, warmed quickly and held its temperature well. The interior maintained a steady 55 to 60 degrees, comfortable enough for sleeping and surviving, using perhaps 1/3 the firewood that conventional cabins were burning, while achieving far superior warmth. Each evening during the extreme cold period, Helen and the children would leave the failing main cabin and walk across the farmyard through the deadly cold to the barn. They would enter through the barn's main door, already much warmer than outside, and then enter the inner cabin, where comfortable warmth awaited them. They would sleep through the night in genuine comfort, while families throughout the territory were slowly freezing in their conventional homes. By January 15th, the crisis throughout the settlement had become catastrophic. Families were burning furniture, burning anything combustible, trying desperately to generate enough heat in their conventional cabins. But physics was against them. 8-inch log walls simply couldn't prevent heat loss fast enough at -43 exterior temperatures. Interior temperatures of 20 to 30 degrees were killing people, especially children and elderly. George Peterson came to Helen's homestead on January 16th, desperate and barely alive. He had walked nearly 2 miles through the -40 cold, suffering severe frostbite in the process. His own cabin had dropped to 22 degrees inside, despite burning every piece of furniture he owned. His wife Martha and their 2 young children were near death from hypothermia. Helen brought Peterson inside the barn immediately. The barn interior, while still cold at approximately -15, was warm enough to start his recovery. Then she brought him into the inner cabin, where the 60-degree warmth felt like a miracle to a man who had been slowly freezing for days. Peterson stood there in the small curved cabin, tears streaming down his frost-damaged face. "How is this possible?" he managed to say. "Your little barn cabin is warm, actually warm, while my solid log cabin is killing my family. I don't understand." Helen explained the principle. The barn provides the first layer of protection, warming the air from -43 outside to -15 in here. This inner cabin only needs to overcome that -15, not the full exterior cold. The double walls with hay insulation prevent heat from escaping. The curved metal roof sheds the cold air. It's a system of layers, each one making the next one's job easier. "My family is dying," Peterson said. "Can we bring them here? Can you help us?" "Of course," Helen said immediately. "We'll take the wagon and bring them now." Over the next 3 days, Helen's barn cabin became a refuge for multiple families whose conventional homes had failed. She and Peterson made trips through the deadly cold, bringing back Peterson's family first, then the Fletcher family, then 2 other families from nearby homesteads. By January 19th, there were 17 people sheltering in Helen's barn, with the inner cabin serving as the core survival space. The inner cabin couldn't hold 17 people at once, so they used it in shifts. The most vulnerable, young children, elderly, those showing severe hypothermia symptoms, stayed in the warm inner cabin continuously. Adults rotated through, warming themselves for a few hours, then moving to the barn's interior to make room for others, while still staying much warmer than they would have been in their failed cabins. The extreme cold continued through January 26th, 18 consecutive days of sustained -35 to -45 temperatures. It was the longest and coldest Arctic outbreak in Minnesota territorial history, creating conditions that no conventional frontier construction could handle. Final death toll throughout the region would reach 43 people, families who froze inside their own homes because conventional cabin construction simply could not maintain survivable warmth during sustained extreme cold of this magnitude. But the 17 people sheltering in Helen's barn survived specifically because of the inner cabin she had built based on dreams that everyone had dismissed as anxiety and foolishness. The double barrier system, barn providing outer protection, inner cabin providing core warmth, had proven capable of maintaining survivable conditions even when every conventional structure in the territory had failed. On February 1st, after the cold had finally moderated, the community held a meeting at the church. George Peterson spoke on behalf of everyone who had sought refuge. Sister Helen built something we all mocked. We called it foolish. We questioned her judgment. We said she was wasting effort on unnecessary protection. We were catastrophically wrong. Her barn cabin, the structure we laughed at, saved 17 lives, including my own family. She understood something we didn't, that true protection requires layers, depth, redundancy. While we trusted in our single-wall cabins, she built protection within protection. We owe her our lives and our deepest apology. Helen accepted the community's thanks with quiet grace. I'm grateful my children and I could provide shelter. The lesson isn't that I was specially wise. It's that we should listen to warnings even when they seem unlikely. My father taught me about layered protection, and my dreams warned me it would be needed. I acted on those lessons and warnings. All of us can learn from this. Sometimes the unlikely preparation is the one that saves lives. She continued living on the homestead for another 26 years, eventually remarrying in 1882 to a Norwegian immigrant named Olaf Svensson, who shared her appreciation for thorough preparation. Together, they refined the barn cabin concept, eventually building similar protective inner structures for 3 other families who wanted that level of security. She lived until 1903, dying at 60. Her obituary specifically mentioned the famous barn cabin that had become legendary throughout Minnesota as the structure that saved lives when conventional construction failed. Modern understanding of thermal engineering confirms the principles Helen applied. Multiple barriers with air gaps provide superior insulation to single thick walls. Each layer reduces the temperature differential the next layer must handle, dramatically improving overall performance. Contemporary cold climate construction uses similar layered approaches, though with modern materials and technology. The story is about a widow who trusted her intuition and her father's teachings, despite universal mockery, who built something everyone called foolish, based on warnings everyone dismissed, who created redundant protection when everyone else trusted in conventional adequacy, and who saved lives by understanding that extreme conditions require extreme preparation. Because sometimes the structure everyone mocks is the one everyone needs. Sometimes building within building is wisdom, not waste. Sometimes dreams are warnings worth heeding. And sometimes the person building a house inside a house understands something everyone else will learn, only when catastrophe proves them right.